Hello, I'm Eugene, and I'm one of the pastors at High Rock. Many of us have been shaken by recent events in Charlottesville, Virginia, where white supremacists protested the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The group clashed with counter-protesters, resulting in violence, death, and the declaration of a state of emergency by the governor of Virginia. Now, there's already been a lot of news coverage and commentary about these events, so I don't think I need to go into any more detail. But perhaps you've seen Ku Klux Klan members or neo-Nazis on TV before, but never like this. Never so emboldened and unashamed. Never in such large numbers, and never so organized. Not in 2017. And we might wonder, how can this happen? The world is more globalized and connected than ever before. We have more resources, technology, and knowledge than ever before. It seems we've come so far, and yet sometimes it becomes painfully clear that systemic racism and misogyny and discrimination and hate are still very much alive and well. And those are just some of the problems in our cities. Last year, the Global Peace Index counted only 10 countries in the entire world that were completely free of conflict. Sometimes the problems of the world seem so big, so complex, it's difficult to know what anyone can do. And what about the conflicts and divisions in our own homes, in our families and relationships? Of course, these may seem small in comparison to racism or the threat of nuclear war, but for anyone going through a divorce or the breakdown of a friendship, the pain is as real as it gets. The fact is, we still live in a world where enmity and conflict are everywhere we look, whether we're turning on the news or trying to navigate our own relationships with our spouses, our friends, or neighbors. And it's not just the enmity that's around us either, it's the enmity that lives in us too. My wife Alice and I are blessed with a great marriage most of the time. Just like any couple, we'll have arguments and we'll disagree about things, and ever so often, we might even have a debate over theological matters. Now, I know what you're all thinking. First of all, that's really romantic. And second, that's just not fair. I mean, I went to Bible college and seminary, and in the midst of our conversation, she just said, "I don't think I agree with that." And I could feel myself getting riled up. I mean, how can you? But I'm an expert. I mean, I think and I talk about this stuff all the time. What do you mean you don't agree? Let's just say I may have overreacted just a little bit. But despite my unfair power advantage, I did not come away feeling like a winner. I may have won the argument, but I still lost. I lost something much more important: love, trust, and safety. I chose being right over being in relationship. And this is my wife whom I love. How can I love my neighbor or my enemy? The problem isn't just out there, it's in here too. Fighting and defensiveness rarely leads anyone to change their mind, much less their heart. Yet, we keep trying anyway. We raise our voices louder and louder to be heard as others do the same. We react defensively, we attack, we protest, we comment angrily on social media, while situations remain largely unchanged. We might argue and try to win in the end, but we all lose. Our world and relationships are marked by hierarchy and domination and power. It's just the way things are. It's the way we are. It's easy to feel discouraged and powerless. We might despair that things will never change. We often just don't know how to deal with conflict or hatred or evil, for that matter. We might even feel legitimate fear about those who threaten our safety, our dignity, or our livelihood, or even worse, of those we love, our family and our friends. To make it even more confusing, we know from the scriptures that there are things that God hates, like injustice and the mistreatment of those who are vulnerable in society. So aren't we supposed to hate those things too? But do we just fight hate with hate? What do we do? Christians believe God has called us to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, which means that we are here for a purpose. And there's a reason God revealed himself in Christ and gave us his Holy Spirit in order to bring his kingdom of love and truth to a world and to people who so desperately need it. So what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to respond to a world that's so broken, especially when we're the ones who are broken too? If Jesus truly is the Son of God, then we'd expect him to have some kind of answer. And if he's really God, then we would expect that his answer would look very different from ours and from the way the world operates. We might not even recognize it because we're so of the world. But what if the power to change the world is right under our noses? What if God's answer is in plain sight, but we're too blind to see, too set in our ways to understand what's right in front of us? If you have ever been in a conflict, if you've ever had anyone do you wrong or betray your trust, or if you've ever experienced racism or discrimination, if you've ever had anyone treat you unfairly, if you've ever felt the hatred of someone or felt hatred for someone, if you've ever felt disrespected or felt contempt for anyone else, then listen carefully today, because Jesus has been there and he shows us the way. And I have to warn you, you might not like it. Jesus' way isn't easy. In fact, it might go against every basic instinct and emotion in you. I mean, hey, that's one of the things that make Christianity so compelling. If Jesus' way is truly divine and not a human invention, then wouldn't we expect it to be unexpected? In the passage that was just read for us a little while ago, Jesus is having his last supper with his disciples. And right before he's arrested to be tortured and crucified. And John begins ominously. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. That last sentence is John's way of saying that Jesus' whole life has been consistent. It's always been about the same thing. Unlike us who change and develop differently over time, Jesus has never varied in his identity or character. Having loved his own, he loved them to the very end, even in this dire hour. John also tells us that Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Just think about that for a moment. The original Greek literally says that Jesus knew the Father had given all things into his hands. In other words, Jesus was in full control of all things. He has unlimited cosmic power. He can do anything he wants. What else does he know? Jesus knows he came from God and that he was returning to God, meaning Jesus knows he's one with the Father. He's one with the infinite creator of the universe. Think about that for a moment. He knows where he comes from. He knows where he's going. He knows who he is. He needs nothing. All things have been given into his hands. And so what does Jesus do? with all that infinite cosmic power, he removes his outer clothing, picks up a towel and a basin of water. He kneels and he washes dirty feet. Many of us have heard, read, and studied this passage numerous times, but Jesus asks an all-important question. Do you understand what I have done for you? The reason he asks it is that it's not obvious that we would. It means there's more going on here than we might think. Do we really understand what he's done for us? If you've ever walked around in sandals in a dusty, hot climate, you'd know that after a whole day, your feet can get pretty dirty and smelly. Well, this is first century Palestine. There are no leash laws, no special camel-only lanes in the streets. They and all other animals would roam free and take care of their business wherever they pleased. And they didn't have street cleaners either, so you can imagine how gross it would be. And in this culture, before reclining to eat, somebody would have to perform the ignoble task of washing these nasty feet. It was a task that was usually reserved for only the lowest ranking servant of the house. And maybe there were no servants around at the time, and you can imagine the disciples starting to look around nervously. Who's going to do it? I mean, let's see, who's the dead weight here, right? I mean, how about Bartholomew? I mean, come on, Bartholomew doesn't really do anything. Thaddeus breathes a sigh of relief. But when Jesus, their master and rabbi, removes his outer clothing to wash his disciples' feet, they're stunned. They're flabbergasted. He comes to Peter, who objects defiantly, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" To which Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." And Peter says, "No, you shall never wash my feet." The disciples have no idea what is going on with this extremely awkward situation. They didn't understand it. They couldn't appreciate it. And they certainly didn't deserve it. It's important to note that Jesus washed all their feet. These feet that walked with him for the past 3 years as his closest friends, these feet that would run away and desert him when he needed them most. John tells us Jesus already knew what Judas had in mind to do. Imagine what it was like for Jesus to kneel before his betrayer, to touch his feet, to get in between the toes, to wipe them clean. He washes the feet of Peter, the denier, of Judas, the betrayer, of his disciples who would desert him. Why? Jesus is being a teacher. Jesus explains, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am." And he's about to teach them a lesson. "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." What does he mean by this? Jesus' point is that this action is an example. It's a pattern to be followed. He's not saying necessarily to do the exact same thing, literally. "Please don't offer to wash my feet." He's saying, do things this way. Do as I have done for you in humility and service and love. Remember that having loved his own, he loved them to the very end. This is merely the culmination of everything he's taught and demonstrated up to this point. Turn the other cheek. If someone wants your shirt, give him your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go a mile with them, go 2 instead. This is the path that he's been on his entire life, and the path that would ultimately lead him to the cross. Jesus' example is one of sacrificial love and service. And so why does this matter? When we're wondering what we can do about all the conflict and strife that plagues our communities and our lives, we don't have to be confused. Jesus gave us an example. Jesus shows us a way that is different from the world. Do we understand what Jesus has done for us? The answer is usually no. We don't realize what we've been given, what we've been shown. The power to change the world is on full display here. But it's hard for us to recognize because it looks so unlike any kind of power we know. To the world, it might look like weakness and vulnerability, but Jesus shows us what true power looks like. He chose humility over pride, self-sacrifice over self-centeredness. He had power. All things were given into his hands, and yet he chose love. And Jesus wants us to discover this same power. He's saying, I'm showing you the way. Here is an example, a pattern. Now you try it. Jesus said, very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Basically, if Christ, our teacher, our master, our Lord, washed feet, then what are we going to do? Are we greater than Jesus? Jesus is inviting us to follow him down the path of service and sacrifice for others. This is his way. This is his example. God washed our feet. He went to the dirtiest, foulest parts of who we are, and he washed them clean with his sacrificial love. And if Jesus will even wash the feet of Judas, his betrayer, will we not wash the feet of those who betray us? Or those we disagree with? Or possibly even hurt us? I told you, you might not like this. So what does foot washing look like in our day, in our lives? Jesus instructed his disciples to start with loving one another. Jesus showed us a pattern of love and sacrifices. And just like learning any new skill, it takes practice. So start with the people who are nearest to you. If we can't even wash the feet of the people we love, we can't possibly wash the feet of the people we don't like. That means when I'm in an argument with Alice, washing her feet means loving her more than my need to win or be right. I need to consider her feelings and needs before my own, which in the end always ends up with both of us winning what we truly want: deeper love and trust. Just as a small example, my two sons, Owen and Evan, went to their first week-long camp this summer, and they even came back alive. During the camp, they had one overnight trip in the woods, and they had two options. One was a hike to a campsite, and the other involved canoeing to an island on the lake. And they wanted to be together, and so Owen asked Evan which one he wanted to do, and he said, I want to do the hike. And Evan asked Owen, and Owen said, he wanted to do the canoe. Now, that's a dilemma. So they each went off and signed up separately. And later, they discovered that Owen signed up for the trip that Evan wanted to go to. And Evan signed up for the trip that Owen wanted to go to. So they each ended up going on the trip that they didn't want because they were both trying to accommodate the other. Aside from this being a lesson on the importance of clear communication, it's also an adorable illustration of giving up one's own preferences in order to be a servant to others. Following the example of Christ means being a servant. So if you're not serving others in some way with your time, your talents, or your resources, it's possible that you're not really serving Christ or following his example. How can you humble yourself and become a servant to your spouse or your family or your coworkers or your friends or your neighbors? Maybe it means using your influence and energy to make others at work look good and not just yourself. Maybe it means going out of your way, even if it's costly, to help or bless a friend or a neighbor. If you aren't doing so already, maybe it means serving in a ministry where there's a need. I remember the first time I met one of our members, Tony Chin. We had just purchased and moved into this building, the sanctuary over on Mass Ave, and there was a ton of work to be done, cleaning and refurbishing all the spaces so that we can open our doors for services. And Tony somehow showed up to one of our work days before he'd ever even attended a service. And there were a variety of jobs to be done, but Tony went straight for the toilets. To clean. Washing feet might mean being willing to do the jobs that no one else wants to do. Now, from the outside, this might look like low self-esteem, which is why even many Christians misunderstand following Jesus' example to mean letting people walk all over us. But let me be clear. Jesus knew who he was, where he came from, and where he was going. All things were given into his hands. And so he demonstrated his absolute power by choosing the way of service and love. That is true power. Following Jesus is not about being passive. Following Jesus is about doing the powerful, active work of God that refuses to use the weapons of the world. Instead, we use the much more powerful spiritual weapons of love, righteousness, truth, and the message of the gospel of peace. This is the power that overturned the Roman Empire. This is the power that Martin Luther King Jr. proclaimed and lived out in the civil rights movement. And this is the same power that can overturn evil today. We are not talking about complacency and keeping quiet. We're talking about courage and sacrifice. There is a time for patience and long-suffering. And there's also a time to stand and fight for justice for those in need. But you can't fight hate with more hate. That only makes things worse. Love is the only power that can disarm hate and turn enemies into friends. I mean, that is the essence of the gospel. We were once at enmity with God, but instead of leaving us as we are, Jesus came as a humble servant to love sacrificially that we might be reconciled back to him. And as God's children, we are called to do the same. Perhaps you've heard of Chicago musician Daryl Davis, who since the 1980s has managed to take down over 200 Ku Klux Klan members. And by take down, I mean get them to leave the Klan, renounce their ways, and change their lives. And do you know how he does it? He doesn't shout them down or try to intimidate them. He doesn't return anger with anger or use any force at all. He simply spends time with them. He listens. He offers them friendship. I mean, we might think, no, what? I mean, that can't work. That's impossible. One Black Lives Matter organizer called Davis's reaching out to white supremacists reprehensible. Another activist was reported telling Davis, stop wasting your time going to people's houses who don't love you. White supremacists can't change. Now, these reactions are understandable. How can you befriend the enemy? How can this man love his enemies? Oh, did I mention Davis is also a Christian? Jesus told us to love our enemies, which makes no sense to the world, but this man took it literally. And look what happened. Now, I am not suggesting that everyone's call as a Christian is to go hug Klansmen. There are many faithful responses to racism and injustice, including listening to those whose voices are not being heard and using whatever privilege or position we might have to lift them up. Clearly, Davis is gifted with a special calling, but please indulge me in a little thought experiment. There are an estimated 5,000 to 8,000 KKK members in America. And over the past few decades, one man managed to convert over 200 of them. And I'm not saying every single KKK member can be converted. Remember, Judas still left that night to betray Jesus. But what if 200 Christians loved and served in such a Christ-like way that each of them converted just 20 KKK members? That would be 4,000. That's already half of all the members using the highest estimate. What if 2,000 Christians did this? Or 2 million? I'm not suggesting that there's a simple solution to systemic racism. I know the issues are complex and don't necessarily get addressed with just a few people changing their mind. But could Christians who love like Jesus, who have the power of Jesus in them, could we turn the tide of culture that makes systemic change much more possible? With God's help, of course. Here's some more math. There are about 1,000-ish people who call High Rock their church. If each High Rocker were to follow Jesus' example and change the lives of just 10 people each, that is 10,000 people. And if those 10,000 loved 10 other people each, that makes 100,000. Now add in all the other High Rocks and all the other churches in the Boston area doing this together, and do you know what you have? Revival. It's often said in Christian circles that the role of the church is to speak truth to power. That is absolutely right. But there's something even more powerful than that. Do you know what's better and more powerful than speaking truth? Of course, it's showing love. There is something that must come before speaking truth. We must show love. Perhaps then we might earn the trust to be heard. Last Sunday, a few hundred High Rockers all over the Boston area skipped worship services, and instead, we all served our communities with the love of Christ. Why? Well, part of it is just the overflow of worship and love for Jesus, and so we want to overflow that love out into our communities. It's also because we want our neighbors to know we are for them, not against them. We want them to know we are here to love. Our church vision states, our vision is to see God transforming every neighborhood and institution in Greater Boston through locally focused congregations who live and love in such a compelling and Christ-like way that our neighbors are challenged to seriously consider the claims of Christ. be reconciled to God and engage in Christian community and serve others in the unique ways God designed them to, so that Boston becomes a city on a hill that will be a blessing to the world. Maybe that's naive, or maybe that's faith in a God who can do the impossible. Do we understand what Jesus has done for us? He's given us the most powerful weapon against evil and fear and division and racism and injustice in the universe. He's given us an example. He's shown us the way. And Jesus said, "Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." Brothers and sisters, my prayer is that we would go forth in Jesus' name, loving and serving and living in such a compelling and Christ-like way that we would be a blessing to the whole world.